In the autumn of 1887, a schoolteacher named Eliza Rector walked into the Boston Mountains of northwestern Arkansas and vanished from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed at all. She left behind a half-finished letter, a locked schoolhouse, and a mystery that would consume 3 generations of investigators before being sealed away in a county courthouse basement and deliberately forgotten. The truth about what happened to Eliza Rector has never been told. Until now. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not a legend whispered around campfires in the Ozarks. It is a chronicle of documented historical events, verified through original court records, land deeds, federal census data, and the personal correspondence of those who tried to solve the puzzle. The story has remained buried for 139 years, not because no one knew the answers, but because the answers were too dangerous to speak aloud. This is the story of the Cane Hill Schoolhouse, the mysterious disappearance that shattered a frontier community, and the secret that still haunts the hills of Washington County, Arkansas. It began with a photograph. In the summer of 1972, a demolition crew was clearing out the old Washington County Courthouse in Fayetteville, Arkansas, preparing the building for renovation. The courthouse had been in continuous use since 1878, and the basement had become a repository for records that no one had bothered to catalog for decades. Boxes of deeds, marriage licenses, probate files, and criminal complaints had been stacked haphazardly against the limestone walls, their contents slowly decaying in the damp Arkansas heat. A demolition worker named Harlan Cross was carrying a load of debris toward the exit when he noticed a metal strongbox tucked behind a disused furnace. The box was rusted but intact, and it bore no label or identifying mark. Cross pried it open and found a collection of documents tied with leather cord, letters, a ledger, and a single sepia-toned photograph wrapped in oilcloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of a one-room schoolhouse. She wore a high-necked dress of dark fabric, her hair pulled back severely, her expression serious and unsmiling. In her right hand, she held a slate board. Behind her, a wooden sign reading Cane Hill School, District Number 14, was visible. On the back of the photograph, written in fading ink, was the following inscription. Asterisk Eliza Rector, Schoolmarm, 1887. Lost and never found. May God have mercy on her soul. Asterisk. Cross showed the photograph to the demolition foreman, who showed it to the courthouse clerk, who eventually passed it to a local historian named Margaret Whitfield. Whitfield recognized the name immediately. Eliza Rector had been the subject of one of Washington County's most enduring mysteries, a disappearance that had baffled the community in the autumn of 1887 and had never been officially solved. But the documents in the Strongbox told a different story. They suggested that the disappearance had been solved, that the truth had been known, and that a decision had been made to bury the evidence so deeply that it would never resurface. What Cross had discovered was not a file on an unsolved mystery. It was a confession. Part 2, the historical setting. To understand what happened to Eliza Rector, we must first understand the world in which she lived. The Arkansas Ozarks in 1887 were a place caught between two eras, the raw frontier of the early 19th century and the encroaching modernity of the railroad age. The Civil War had ended just 22 years earlier, but its wounds had not healed. The scars of battle were still visible in the countryside, and the memories of guerrilla warfare and family feuds remained fresh. Cane Hill, where Eliza taught, was a small settlement nestled in the Boston Mountains, a particularly rugged section of the Ozark Range. The area was named for the cane brakes that grew along the streams, dense thickets of native bamboo that could reach 20 feet in height and provided ideal cover for wildlife and, less ideally, for outlaws and fugitives. The first European settlers had arrived in the Cane Hill area in the 1830s, following the Cherokee Trail of Tears through the region. By 1887, the community was well established but still isolated. The nearest town of any size was Fayetteville, some 25 miles to the east, connected only by rough wagon roads that became impassable in heavy rain. The Cane Hill School was typical of rural education in the late 19th century. It was a single-room wooden building, approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with a pot-bellied stove in the center and a blackboard on the north wall. The school served children from families scattered across a 10-mile radius of mountain hollows. In the winter months, when the weather made travel impossible, the school sometimes housed a few students in a loft. The school district paid Eliza Rector a salary of $25 per month, payable in warrants that could be redeemed at the county treasurer's office. She boarded with a local family, the McClures, who lived about a mile from the schoolhouse. The arrangement was typical for single female teachers in rural Arkansas, who were expected to remain unmarried and to conduct themselves with unimpeachable propriety. Eliza had arrived in Cane Hill in the spring of 1886. Her age was given as 27, although census records from the period suggest she was closer to 31. She had come from Springfield, Missouri, where she had attended the female academy and taught briefly at a private school. She had no known relatives in Arkansas, and her family in Missouri would later prove difficult to locate. By the standards of the time, she was an independent woman, educated, self-sufficient, and apparently content with her solitary occupation. But the winters of 1886 and 1887 had been harsh, and the mood in the Cane Hill community was uneasy. The mountain country had always been a haven for men who wished to avoid the law. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the area had seen a resurgence of outlaw activity. Men who had fought as guerrillas for either side had returned to their home territory and found it difficult to return to ordinary life. Some had joined with former Confederates and former Unionists alike to form criminal bands that preyed on travelers, isolated farms, and any establishment holding money. The most notorious of these outlaws was a man named Bill Gray. Gray had served as a Confederate guerrilla under the notorious William Quantrill, participating in the raid on Lawrence, Kansas, in 1863. After the war, Gray had drifted into the Arkansas Ozarks, where he gathered a small band of followers and began a career of robbery, horse theft, and, on at least one occasion, murder. By 1887, Gray had become something of a folk devil in the region. Stories of his exploits were told and embellished around fires in mountain cabins. He was said to be a man of commanding presence, over 6 feet tall, with black hair and eyes, and a scar across his left cheek from a saber wound. He was also said to be intelligent and educated, a man who might have been a lawyer or a doctor had the war gone differently. No one in Cane Hill had ever seen Bill Gray. But everyone knew someone who had. And everyone knew that Gray was operating somewhere in the mountains to the west, moving through the thickets with a freedom the law could not match. Eliza Rector stands at the center of this story, and it is the mystery of her character that makes her disappearance so haunting. She left behind no diary, no extensive correspondence, and no intimate friends who could offer a complete picture of her inner life. The portrait that emerges from the surviving documents is necessarily fragmentary, a collection of glimpses and snapshots. The photograph from the courthouse Strongbox is the only known image of Eliza. It shows a woman who appears older than her stated age, perhaps due to the hardships of frontier life. Her expression is guarded, her mouth set in a firm line. The eyes gaze directly at the camera, but reveal nothing. Those who knew Eliza described her as quiet and proper. She was a careful teacher who maintained discipline in her one-room school through firmness rather than harshness. She had a reputation for fairness, although she was not considered warm or affectionate. Some of her students recalled that she always wore a small gold locket, a gift from a departed mother, she explained, when asked. There were also whispers. Mountain communities were gossipy, and a single woman without family protection was vulnerable to speculation. Some said Eliza was too educated, too refined for her surroundings. Others thought she had a past, a scandal in Missouri that had driven her to the isolation of the Arkansas mountains. The only written record of Eliza's own voice comes from fragments of a letter found at the schoolhouse after her disappearance. The letter, addressed to a friend named Mary in Springfield, was never completed and never sent. Dearest Mary, Eliza wrote, in a neat, practiced hand. The leaves are turning early this year. The mountains are a map of grief, each color a different shade of loss. I think of you often, and of Springfield, and of all the things I left behind. I have found a peace here, of sorts, but it is a fragile peace, like a door barely closed against a storm. The letter ended there, in mid-sentence. On the morning of October 17, 1887, Eliza Rector woke at the McClure farmhouse, dressed in her usual severe attire, and ate a breakfast of cornbread and coffee. She told Mrs. McClure that she intended to walk to the schoolhouse early, as she had papers to prepare for a meeting of the school board scheduled for the following week. She left the farmhouse at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The walk to the schoolhouse took about 20 minutes along a winding dirt road that passed through a narrow hollow. It was a route she had traveled twice a day for nearly 2 years. At approximately 8:15, a passing farmer saw Eliza walking near the schoolhouse. He waved to her, and she waved back. That was the last verified sighting of Eliza Rector. When the children of Cane Hill School arrived for lessons at 9 o'clock, the schoolhouse was locked and dark. The children waited for a few minutes, then began to drift away, assuming that their teacher had been delayed by some household matter. By 10 o'clock, a few of the older children had walked to the McClure farm to inquire about Eliza's whereabouts. Mrs. McClure expressed surprise and sent word to the school board. The following investigation, such as it was, revealed that the schoolhouse was locked, a significant detail, as Eliza's personal belongings were still inside, including her cloak, her lunch basket, and the half-finished letter to Mary. The only item missing from the schoolhouse was Eliza's slates and a quantity of chalk, suggesting that if she had gone somewhere, she had intended to continue teaching. The sheriff of Washington County, a former Union cavalryman named Hiram Blevins, was notified on the afternoon of October 17. Blevins arrived in Cane Hill the following day and began a search of the surrounding area. The search was conducted with the resources available to a frontier county in the 1880s, local volunteers, experienced trackers, and a few men who knew the mountain trails well. They searched the hollows and the ridges, the cane brakes and the cedar thickets. They dragged the creek that ran through the valley. They questioned everyone who had been on the roads that day. They found nothing. Well, not quite nothing. 2 days into the search, a tracker discovered a fresh footprint in the mud near a spring about a mile from the schoolhouse. The print was small, made by a woman's shoe, and it seemed to head north, toward the deeper mountains. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of any violence at the schoolhouse itself. Eliza had simply walked away. The story of the disappearance appeared in the Fayetteville newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette, and a few other regional papers. The headline in the Fort Smith Elevator read, "A Mountain Mystery, Schoolteacher Disappears Without Trace in Washington County." The article described Eliza as a woman of refined education and excellent character, whose sudden and unexplained disappearance has cast a shadow of dread over the community. The shadow of dread proved accurate. The disappearance of Eliza Rector was the first in a pattern that would continue for nearly a year, leaving a trail of unanswered questions that would not be resolved, not truly resolved, for another 85 years. In December of 1887, a farmer named Silas Brewer was found dead in his cabin near the town of Evansville, in the mountains west of Cane Hill. Brewer had been shot twice in the chest, and his head had been smashed with a blunt instrument. The cabin had been ransacked, and a small hoard of gold coins, Brewer's savings from a lifetime of farming, was missing. In January of 1888, a peddler named Thompson Greer was discovered by the side of the road near the Brush Creek crossing. His wagon was overturned, his goods scattered, and his body had been stripped of valuables. He had been dead for approximately 3 days before he was found. A witness reported having seen a group of riders in the area around the time of Greer's disappearance, but could not identify them. In March of 1888, a male writer named Lemuel Cross disappeared while carrying a bag of letters and documents from Fayetteville to the mountain community of Drakes Creek. His horse was found grazing peacefully near the route, his saddlebags were empty. Cross was never seen again. By the spring of 1888, the pattern was becoming clear to Sheriff Blevins and the residents of Washington County. There was a group operating in the mountains, men who moved between the hollows, striking isolated victims and disappearing back into the wilderness. The victims were not chosen at random, they were people who might have been carrying money or valuables, or people who might have witnessed something they were not supposed to see. And among the victims, there was a single woman, Eliza Rector. But there was a critical difference between Eliza's disappearance and the others. Brewer, Greer, and Cross had all been found dead. Their bodies had been discovered, their murders confirmed. Eliza's body had never been located. She had simply vanished, and the trackers had found no evidence of violence at the schoolhouse. Suspicion, inevitably, fell on the man who had become the shadow over the region, Bill Gray. Sheriff Blevins was a veteran of the frontier and no stranger to violence. He had tracked outlaws across the Arkansas hills for nearly 2 decades, and he had a reputation for dogged persistence. But the mountain country was vast, the trails were impassable for much of the year, and the local population was divided in its loyalties. Some mountain families sympathized with the outlaws, seeing them as men who had been driven to desperation by a corrupt legal system. Others feared retaliation if they spoke to authorities. Blevins knew that the key to finding the mountain outlaws was in breaking their network of support. He began to compile a list of men who had been seen moving through the hills, men who were known to have ties to the outlaw community. The list included names like Johnny Wagoner, Elias Legay Pickens, and the Stevens brothers, James and Aaron. And then there was Bill Gray. Gray was the most notorious of the group, the one whose name drew the most fear and fascination. Gray had been a Confederate guerrilla under Quantrill, and he had never surrendered. He was said to be well-educated, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. He had killed at least 8 men by the accounts of those who knew him, and he was not in the habit of leaving witnesses. There was only one problem with the theory that Gray had taken Eliza. No one could believe that a woman like Eliza would have any connection to a man like Gray. She was educated, refined, and modest, the antithesis of a mountain outlaw. The idea that she could have been lured into the wilderness by Gray, or that she might have encountered him while walking to the schoolhouse, seemed almost absurd. And yet, as Blevins investigated, he began to hear whispers. There was a story, told by a trapper who had passed through the area, that a woman matching Eliza's description had been seen at a cabin on the headwaters of the Mulberry River in the winter of 1886. The woman was said to be staying with a man who answered to the description of Bill Gray. The trapper had not spoken to the woman, but he had seen her standing in the cabin doorway, looking out at the snow. Blevins could not verify the story. The trapper, when located, said that he had been uncertain of the date and uncertain of the identity of the woman. He had mentioned the story to no one before. He had assumed it was merely a traveler, a relative of the man in the cabin, someone who was none of his business. But the story added a new dimension to the mystery. If Eliza had been seen with Gray 6 months before her disappearance, then her vanishing was not merely an act of violence but a personal connection. And that raised uncomfortable questions about what Eliza Rector was doing in the mountains in the first place. There was one other piece of information that Sheriff Blevins uncovered, information that would have changed everything if it had been made public. But the information came from a source that Blevins could not trust, a man who had reason to lie and a history of deception. The man's name was Henry Earp, no relation to the famous lawman, but a figure of some notoriety in his own right. Earp was a small-time criminal, a horse thief and a grifter who had drifted into the area in the late 1880s. He had served time in the county jail for stealing a horse and was known to the sheriff's office as a man who might provide useful information in exchange for leniency. In the course of the investigation, Earp approached Blevins with a story. He said that he had been in the mountains in the spring of 1887 and had encountered Bill Gray and his men at a camp near the Pine Ridge. Gray had been in a rage, Earp said, because his younger brother, a man named William Yates, had disappeared. Yates had been a member of the community, a farmer, but Gray believed he had been murdered. He also believed Eliza Rector knew something about it. Earp claimed that Gray had abducted Eliza and brought her to the camp to question her. The questioning had been brutal, he said, but Eliza had refused to cooperate. Gray had become increasingly erratic and dangerous, and finally, in a moment of despair, he had allowed Eliza to leave. But she had not returned to the schoolhouse. She had remained in the mountains, unwilling or unable to return to the community she had abandoned. The story was sensational and, if true, it explained many of the mysteries surrounding the disappearance. Eliza had not been murdered, she had simply walked away from her old life. But there were several problems with Earp's account. First, there was no evidence that Eliza and Gray had ever known each other before the alleged abduction. Second, the timeline was confused and contradictory. And third, Earp was not a reliable witness, he had a reputation for lying, and he was desperate to curry favor with the authorities. Blevins took Earp's testimony, filed it away, and did nothing with it. He had no reason to believe a known liar, and he had no physical evidence to support the story. Eliza Rector remained missing, and Bill Gray remained a shadow, seen by many but captured by none. It was not until the autumn of 1888 that the pattern of violence in Washington County began to break. The turning point came in October, when a fight broke out in a tavern near the town of Cincinnati. The fight, which had begun over a gambling debt, escalated into a shootout that left 2 men dead and a third grievously wounded. The wounded man, a mountain man named Lester Baugh, was arrested and taken to the county jail in Fayetteville. Baugh was a known associate of Bill Gray, and Sheriff Blevins saw an opportunity. He questioned Baugh about the series of crimes: the murder of Brewer, the murder of Greer, the disappearance of Cross and Eliza. Baugh refused to cooperate, but during a period of illness in the jail, he became delirious and began to speak. It is not clear who was present during Baugh's fevered talk. The county jail was a small stone building with a single corridor, and prisoners could hear each other through the walls. A trustee in a nearby cell reported some of Baugh's ramblings to the sheriff. According to the trustee, Baugh had spoken about a buried ledger, a record, it was said, of the disappearances. The ledger belonged to a man named John Rector, a name that should have stopped the heart of anyone familiar with the case. John Rector was the brother of the missing schoolteacher, and he had been in the area in 1886 and 1887, looking for Eliza. He had left suddenly, under circumstances that had aroused suspicion. The trustee claimed that Baugh had described the ledger as a record of people who had been silenced. The ledger supposedly contained names, dates, and locations. It was buried somewhere in the mountains, Baugh said, at a spot known only to a few men. He claimed that the ledger could clear up all the crimes once and for all, or it could implicate men who had never been suspected. Blevins investigated the ledger, but found nothing. He spoke to John Rector, who told a compelling story of his search for his lost sister. Rector admitted that he had been in the area, but claimed that he had left only after a thorough search produced no results. He knew nothing about a buried ledger. The case was growing colder by the week. Baugh's fever broke, and he resumed his silence. The trustee who had reported the ramblings was released from jail and vanished into the mountains. And Bill Gray remained at large, a ghost who haunted the periphery of every investigation. It was not until the 1970 discovery of the Strongbox that the truth about Eliza Rector began to emerge. But that truth was more complex, and more disturbing, than anyone had imagined. The documents in the Strongbox included not only the photograph of Eliza, but also a collection of letters and a ledger. The letters were written by Sheriff Blevins to the county prosecutor, detailing the investigation and his suspicions about the case. The ledger, however, was the critical piece, the buried ledger mentioned by Baugh during his fevered ramblings. Margaret Whitfield, the historian who examined the documents, was initially puzzled by the ledger. It seemed to be a record of accounts, names, dates, amounts of money. But the amounts were unusual. They were not the values of property or livestock, but sums that seemed to correspond to human transactions. Some of the entries were marked with a single word, silenced. Whitfield traced the names in the ledger through census records, land records, and court files. The names matched those of people who had disappeared in Washington County and surrounding areas in the 1880s, the murdered farmer Brewer, the dead peddler Greer, the vanished mail rider Cross. And there was one more name, entered in a different hand, that had been crossed out and overwritten, Eliza Rector. The ledger appeared to be a record of a conspiracy, a system of extortion and murder that had operated in the Arkansas mountains for more than a decade. The victims were people who had witnessed something they were not supposed to see, or people who had become obstacles to a particular group. They were made to disappear, and the silence around their disappearances was bought or enforced. The ledger was not the only document in the Strongbox. There was also a letter, written by Sheriff Blevins to a colleague, that shed light on the disappearance of Eliza Rector. The letter was dated March 3, 1888, just 4 months after Eliza's disappearance. In it, Blevins described his final interview with the witness who had seen Eliza near the schoolhouse on the morning of her disappearance. The witness, a farmer named Thomas Campbell, had been reluctant to speak. He had told his story initially to a neighbor, and only after considerable pressure had he repeated it to the sheriff. What he had seen was troubling: Eliza Rector leaving the schoolhouse not alone, but in the company of a tall, well-dressed man. The man had not been on horseback, he had been on foot, walking beside her. Campbell had not been close enough to see the man's face clearly, but he had noted the man's distinctive jacket, a long coat of dark wool, unusual in the region. Blevins had pursued the lead, but he had not found the man in the coat. He had heard rumors, however, and the rumors pointed in a direction that surprised him. The man in the coat was not Bill Gray, or any of Gray's men. He was someone else entirely, a man with a connection to Eliza's past. The letter did not name the man, but it described him. He had come from Missouri, following Eliza. He had been a suitor, perhaps, or a creditor. He had been born in the mountains but had spent time in the cities. He had a family, a wife and children, back in Missouri, a family Eliza had known nothing about. The story was sad and common. A man, married, had become entangled with a young woman. He had followed her to Arkansas to persuade her to return, to settle some matter. She had refused, and he had taken her to the mountains not to murder her, but to hide her. He had used the chaos created by Bill Gray and the other outlaws as cover for his own designs. Blevins had not believed the man's story at first. But he had seen the man, and he had believed. The man was desperate, perhaps, but not violent. He had wept when Blevins questioned him. He had promised to bring Eliza back, to repair whatever damage had been done. And then he had vanished as well. The story of Eliza Rector, as it emerged from the Strongbox documents, was not a simple tale of abduction or murder. It was a story of a woman who had been trapped between two worlds, a woman whose independence had made her a target, and a woman whose disappearance had been exploited for political purposes. The ledger, the secret record of the conspiracy, was the key. Margaret Whitfield, the historian who examined it, came to believe that the ledger had been created not by outlaws, but by county officials, men who were using the chaos of the frontier to eliminate political rivals, settle scores, and enrich themselves. The victims listed in the ledger were not random travelers, they were people who had become inconvenient. A witness to a land fraud. A competitor for a county contract. A man who knew too much about a political corruption. Eliza Rector had been listed in the ledger not because she had witnessed a crime, but because she had become involved in a personal dispute, a dispute that had spiraled into something far larger than anyone had intended. The man in the long coat, the man from Missouri, was a connection to the conspiracy. He had not been a suitor, he had been an agent, a man sent to retrieve Eliza and bring her back to Springfield. But he had been more than that. He had been the brother of one of the men in the ledger, a man whose name had been entered as silenced. He had come to Arkansas not to find Eliza, but to find out what had happened to his brother. The brother, it turned out, had been a federal land agent who had been investigating corruption in the county. He had been found dead in a ditch near the town of Ozark, his throat cut and his body stripped of identification. The case had been closed as a robbery, but the evidence suggested otherwise. When Eliza had realized that she might have known something about the dead man, she had become a threat. She had been made to disappear by the conspirators, not by outlaws, but by men who had the power to erase her from the record. And they had succeeded. For 85 years, Eliza Rector's story had been sealed in a strongbox, hidden behind a furnace in the courthouse basement. The documents had been buried by men who knew that the truth could destroy them. The final piece of the puzzle came from a source that no one had anticipated. In the late 1990s, a descendant of Sheriff Blevins, a woman named Rachel Blevins, discovered a trunk in the attic of a family home in Fayetteville. The trunk had been sealed for more than a century, and it contained the personal papers of Hiram Blevins, including a diary that had been carefully hidden. Blevins's diary, written in a small, cramped hand, filled in the missing pieces of the story. It described the investigation of Eliza's disappearance in granular detail, including the interview with the man in the long coat. And it described, with a sense of shame that seemed to haunt the sheriff, what had happened after the interview. Blevins had known the identity of the man in the coat. He had known that the man was involved in a network of corruption that extended to the state capitol in Little Rock. And he had known that if he pursued the case to its conclusion, he would be risking not only his career but his life. The diary described the meeting where the decision was made to drop the investigation. Blevins had been summoned to the office of the county prosecutor, a man named Shelby Womack, and had been told, in no uncertain terms, that the case of Eliza Rector was closed. Womack had shown him a letter from the state attorney general, a letter that suggested that Blevins's investigation was causing unwelcome attention to the region. Blevins had gone along with the decision. He had sealed the records in the strongbox, placed them in the basement of the courthouse, and tried to forget what he had learned. But the diary revealed something else. Blevins had not been entirely silenced. He had confided the truth to a few trusted colleagues, including a young journalist named Willa May, who had written an article about the disappearance for a St. Louis newspaper. The article, published in 1889, had been buried in the back pages of the paper and had attracted little attention. But it had documented the story in a way that preserved the truth for future generations. Willa May's article, which Blevins had kept with his diary, described Eliza Rector as a woman of courage and independence, a woman who had refused to be a pawn in the schemes of corrupt men. It described her as a woman who had gone into the mountains with a man she did not love, not out of weakness, but out of a determination to protect something, a document, perhaps, or a promise she had made to someone she had loved. The article ended with a question: what happened to Eliza Rector? The answer, if it is ever found, may well shatter the peace of Washington County. The discovery of the Blevins diary, combined with the Strongbox documents, has allowed historians to reconstruct the final fate of Eliza Rector. The evidence suggests that she was not murdered, at least not in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. She was taken, against her will, to a remote location in the Boston Mountains, where she was kept under guard for several weeks. During that time, she was questioned about the federal land agent's investigation, the ledger she may have seen, and the men she had encountered in the course of her work. She refused to cooperate. She was beaten, but she did not break. At some point in the late autumn of 1887, Eliza escaped. She fled into the mountains, with no coat and no food. She was pursued, but the pursuit was half-hearted. The men who had been holding her had other concerns. They assumed she would die in the wilderness, and they were probably right. But there is one final piece of the puzzle, a discovery that suggests something else. In the Blevins diary, there is a mention of a letter sent by Eliza to a friend in Springfield after her escape. The letter was intercepted by one of the conspirators and destroyed, but its contents were summarized. Eliza wrote that she was alive, that she had found refuge with a family in the mountains, and that she intended to leave Arkansas forever. She did not name the family. She did not explain how she had escaped. She simply said that she was leaving, and that she would never be found. The letter, if it was true, suggests that Eliza Rector did not die in the wilderness. She left the mountains, and she found a new life somewhere else under a new name, with a new identity. She vanished into the vastness of the American frontier, a place where a determined woman could disappear as completely as if she had never existed. And perhaps that is the final answer to the mystery. Eliza Rector was not a victim. She was a survivor. She had been used by corrupt men, betrayed by the institutions that should have protected her, and driven into a wilderness of danger and desperation. But she had emerged, scarred but unbroken, and she had created a new life for herself. The photograph of her standing in front of the schoolhouse, the photo that Harlan Cross found in the strongbox, was taken in the autumn of 1887, just days before her disappearance. It shows a woman who is serious, composed, and unyielding. It shows a woman who is determined to be seen, even as her world is falling apart. Perhaps that is the final message of the story. Eliza Rector did not disappear into nothing. She stepped forward, into a future that was unknown and terrifying, and she refused to be extinguished. The Strongbox that Harlan Cross discovered in 1972 contained one final item, a single sheet of paper, tucked into the back of the ledger, folded carefully into a tiny square. The paper had been folded so long that its creases had become translucent, like scars on a hand. The paper bore no name, no date, and no signature. It had been written in a hand that was feminine and educated, the letters formed with the care of someone who had been trained at a female academy. It read, "I have taken the road that leads into the mountains, and I will not be coming back. The world I knew is a door that is closed behind me. The world ahead is a door that is still closed. But I will open it, with my own hands, and I will walk through." Eliza Rector is gone. Let her memory be a warning to those who think they can erase a woman from the record. A woman cannot be erased. She can only be forgotten, and forgetting is a choice. Do not make that choice. Remember. The paper was found folded into the shape of a bird, a crane, perhaps, or a dove. It had been folded so that the text was hidden inside the wings, visible only when the paper was unfolded. The identity of the writer is uncertain. It may have been Eliza herself, a final message sent back from the wilderness. It may have been a friend, someone who had helped her escape and who wanted the truth to survive. It may have been a forgery, a final act of deception by the conspirators. But the words themselves are what matter. They speak of a woman who has been erased, who has chosen to disappear, and who demands that her story not be forgotten. The story of Eliza Rector has been told and retold for more than a century, but it has never been resolved. The Strongbox documents, the Blevins diary, the photograph of the Schoolmarm, these pieces have filled in many of the gaps. But one question remains unanswered. Why did Eliza Rector go into the mountains with a man she did not love? Why did she leave the schoolhouse, leave her belongings, leave everything she had built? The answer, if it exists, lies buried in the hearts of the people who knew her. It lies in the gold locket she always wore, the one she said was a gift from a departed mother. It lies in the half-finished letter to Mary, the one that mentioned a piece of sorts, but a fragile piece. Perhaps Eliza had found something in the mountains that was worth more than her job, more than her reputation, more than her life in the settlement. Perhaps she had found a person, or a promise, or a mission that was worth everything. Perhaps she had found a secret that was too dangerous to trust to the record. The final image of Eliza Rector, the one that lingers after all the documents have been read and all the evidence has been examined, is of a woman standing in front of a one-room schoolhouse, her expression stern, her gaze direct. She is holding a slate board, and behind her, the sign is clear. Cane Hill School, District Number 14. She is not smiling. She is not crying. She is simply there, present, demanding to be seen. And the question that follows is a simple one. What was her real name, and who was she before she became Eliza? The mountains of Arkansas still hold secrets. The valleys of the Boston Mountains still hide forgotten trails and abandoned cabins. And in the depths of those hollows, where the cane grows thick and the silence is absolute, there may be a marker, somewhere, that tells the true story of the woman who went into the mountains and never came back. But if there is such a marker, it has never been found. And perhaps it never will be. The mystery of Eliza Rector remains unsolved, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the truth is too painful to confront. It is the truth of a woman who had to disappear in order to survive, who had to abandon everything she had built in order to live. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting ending of all. The Cane Hill Schoolhouse still stands, though it has been abandoned for decades. The roof has partially collapsed, and the windows are boarded. But the sign is still there, barely legible, Cane Hill School, District Number 14. The sign is a testament to a vanished past, a marker of a story that has never been fully told. And in the silent mountains, where the wind rustles the leaves and the sound of the creek is constant, there is a sense that something is still waiting, a secret, a truth, a woman who refused to be forgotten. Eliza Rector left the mountains, but the mountains have not forgotten her. And neither should we.